Hello, my name's Faye, and for Nonfiction November I read 3 nonfiction books, which is more than I usually read, but less than I intended to. Nonfiction November in the spirit of reading as many nonfiction books as you can, or more than you tend to, hosted, brought to popularity by Olive, is a wonderful experience. For me, it was really interesting to push myself to read books that I tend to not gravitate towards, and I read some great and some mediocre things. The first book I read was a small one, which was Men Explain Things to Me by Rebecca Solnit. This almost feels a little dated now, even though I believe it's only 4 years old. In this, the first essay talks about the mansplaining phenomenon that she coins. I did really like that essay. There's some other essays in here which I found really interesting, some especially talking about the inequality of the idea of marriage and how being against same-sex marriage essentially is also being sexist towards the sort of heteronormative relationships, which I thought was a really interesting spin, talking about a topic that usually is talked about in such an emotional way. I thought that was the main strength about this essay collection anyway, that she is very self-reflected. She says things and then makes it clear for even the most dim reader that when she says something about a man that has aggrieved her in the past, that does not mean that she hates every man out there. So I think it's unfortunate that you do have to say that, but I applaud her for making sure that you really can't misunderstand her. I think you have to be really, really ready to want to misunderstand what she's saying in this if you're going to pick holes into this. Had a bit of a dip for me in the middle. Not all essays were equally strong, which is why I believe I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. I enjoy it, and even though you could imagine an updated version with the sort of more recent politics that are going on in America, because this is very much focused on America, unfortunately much of it is still very much relevant today. I would recommend this. Then I read Proust and the Squid. What's the subtitle? The Story and Science of the Reading Brain by Maryanne. This took me far longer to read, not only because it is a little bit longer, but also because it is so dense, so theoretical. Unfortunately, in my opinion, Maryanne doesn't fully succeed in writing an enjoyable, flowing, full-length book. You can tell that she's a researcher and a scientist, and she's probably very well versed at writing articles, which come with certain benchmarks that you have to reach. You have to cite all your sources, and you can trust that your reader generally knows a fair amount about what you're talking about. And I feel like she found it quite tricky to make this readable for your sort of average Faye, and sometimes be a bit more lenient on this sort of scientific way of writing. The idea between Proust and the Squid is talking about how mankind started to write and what that meant for our development, both culturally and sociologically, but also neurologically, and how the brain changed to adapt to what she thinks is not actually a natural thing for mankind to do, to read. As someone who loves to read and someone who's interested in psychology, I thought this would tick all the boxes, but I did at times get a bit bored. It pains me to say, when she sort of harped on about the ways in which the brain and the plasticity of the brain made for different regions to develop differently depending on how advanced you are as a reader. There's a whole section talking about reading disorders, dyslexia, whatever you want to call it. And even though, again, that's something that in theory I'm really interested in, I thought she just flip-flopped back and forth between being highly, highly theoretical and dense and scientific, and then really emotional and personal. Her own son has dyslexia, so this is very relevant for her both on a personal but also a professional level, because she does work as a language researcher, scientist, neurologist. I'm not entirely sure. I didn't check her out afterwards, which is also a sign of me just not being fully enthralled with this book. I mean, I don't want to discourage you from reading this because the topic is so interesting. The beginning part especially, when she talks about the development of script, I thought was interesting because I didn't know much about it. And there are some like elements of this and ideas in this that were new to me, and those I found really interesting. For instance, that different natives with dyslexia tend to have different issues with their reading fluency, depending on the phonological differences in their native language, something I hadn't thought about. But on the whole, slightly disappointing. I gave this 2 out of 5 stars. And then the third non-fiction book that I completed was H is for Hawk by Helen Macdonald. This is a memoir which Helen wrote all about her rearing a goshawk. I believe it's called goshawk. I'm not sure. Goshawk or Goshawk? Goshawk, that's what I'm going to go with. After her father passes away, and she essentially falls into a depression and gets totally obsessed with rearing this hawk that she adopts, which seems to be almost necessary in rearing these birds of prey. And I thought it was very sad and tender. It was one of the first sort of nature non-fiction books, with a bit of a stretch because it has such a personal voice to it, that I've ever read, and I really enjoyed that. So this has sort of opened up my willingness to dive into that genre a little bit more. I thought it was beautifully written. I read afterwards that some people weren't a big fan of her tying in the story of T.H. White, the author who wrote about a book called The Goshawk, I believe, some point, I don't know, early 20th century, 40s, 50s, when was he kicking? T.H. White, the author of The Once and Future King. But I thought it really lent a different viewpoint to the whole topic of falconry and how that developed, and I found it fascinating to hear about certain negative connotations and associations with the whole field, how much it was a sort of boys' club, how certain prominent figures in Nazi Germany were fascinated in the sport and the rearing of these animals, because it was something that was seen as difficult, and the animals were prestigious and were killers that you could tame. So I thought this was a great book. Just everything about it was great. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Sorry about the sun. And I recommend this basically to anyone because I didn't think that I was the perfect reader, and I loved it. And then I thought I'd just briefly mention I've started reading Unorthodox by Deborah Feldman. This is also her memoir about how she grew up in an Orthodox Jewish sect. And I'm finding this a little more difficult to get into than I had expected, but so far so good. And the only book that I didn't end up reading, which I was planning to read, was On the Move by Oliver Sacks. The chunkiness of this just put me off, and I was traveling a little bit in the month, so I didn't want to lug a book around with me. But I loved Nonfiction November. It really reminded me to read a little bit more diverse when it comes to content, not diverse when it comes to authors. I must admit, I only read female authors, 1 English, 2 American, so I guess I still have something to polish up there a little bit. I hope you loved Nonfiction November. Tell me what you read, and I'll see you very soon. Bye.